Kansas.
Thank you, Mr. President. It seems like we've been in this position previously this week. Mr. President,
Senator,
I understand
quorum
we're in a
call.
quorum call, and I would ask that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, thank you. I'd like to discuss with my colleagues here in the Senate an amendment that I have offered to the continuing resolution that's now pending before the Senate. It's amendment number 55. And I've spoken about this issue on the floor previously this week, but want to reiterate the merits of this amendment and ask my colleagues for their support. Amendment number 55 deals with this issue of air traffic control towers. And under the administration's plan in implementing sequestration, the plan is to close on April the 7th, just a few days from now, 173 air traffic control towers across the country. And the amendment that I'm offering avoids that the administration would no longer be able to do that. I believe that they shouldn't for numerous reasons. But what we do in order to accomplish that is to transfer $50 million from two accounts, one dealing with research at the Department of Transportation and one dealing with unencumbered balances. And so this is an example of what we've talked about before, about we can make better decisions than across-the-board cuts. And in fact, the amendment that I'm offering deals with an issue that is not even an across-the-board cut. In closing the contract towers, in eliminating the contract tower program, the administration is cutting that program 75%. Now, sequestration is described to us as, in most circumstances, an across-the-board 5% cut. The amendment that I'm offering continues the 5% cut that would occur for the air traffic control tower program, so that they would be treated just like other programs at the Department of Transportation and throughout government, that they are not singled out for elimination of a program, resulting in a 75% reduction in that program's funding, not just the more minor 5%. And so the administration's decision to close contract towers is far from balanced. And in choosing this program, in my view, have taken the opportunity to really damage the safety and security of the flying public of Americans. And I want to talk about that in a moment, but there was also the suggestion that this is a provincial argument on my part, that it's something that I care specifically about Kansas and my home state. Certainly not that there's anything wrong with caring about our home states. That's what we do here, and it's part of our responsibility. But this is far from just being a Kansas issue, and many states and members of the United States Senate are more greatly affected by this cut, this elimination, than my home state. And in fact, this amendment has the sponsorship of 26 Republican and Democrat co-sponsors. More Democrat senators here are co-sponsors of this amendment than Republican. But it's Senators Roberts, Inhofe, Blumenthal, Blunt, Johans, Kirk, Manchin, Hagan, Klobuchar, Baucus, Tester, Enzi, Vitter, Bozeman, Pryor, Merkley, Wyden, Kane, Warner, Ayotte, Shaheen, Risch, Crapo, Murphy, Rockefeller, and Wicker. Doesn't sound very provincial to me, and in fact, 42 states will have their air traffic control towers eliminated. This amendment is broadly supported by the aviation industry, and if there's an aspect of this that is unique to Kansas, it's we manufacture many general aviation aircraft. We are the air capital of the world. But this amendment, while being supported by the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, by the National Business Aviation Association, by the National Air Transport Association, is also supported by the American Association of Airport Executives and the National Association of Air Traffic Controllers. Again, not a very provincial amendment when sponsored by so many of my colleagues, affecting 43 states of the United States, and broadly supported by the aviation industry as a reasonable, common sense solution to a problem we face. And I've been adamant about bringing this amendment to the floor. I'm a member of the Appropriations Committee. I will have the opportunity, in fact, I serve on the subcommittee that deals with the Department of Transportation. I should and hope to have the opportunity to deal with this and other issues related to the Department of Transportation in the normal appropriations process that hopefully will follow the passage of a budget. So I ought to be in a position to be helpful to the cause I believe in at a point later in time. But here's the problem. The air traffic control towers will close on April the 7th. We will never get to an appropriation process between now, here at the end of March, and April the 7th. So the Appropriations Committee and ultimately the Senate, the United States House of Representatives, the President, will never have the ability to restore a program that is gone April the 7th. So while I've tried to put myself in a position to be helpful to the cause in the long run, there is no long-run battle to be fought because the control towers are gone in just a matter of a few short days. So this amendment matters. This is my last opportunity. If and when cloture is invoked later today on the underlying bill, there is no opportunity for amendments to be considered. And so my colleagues who indicate to me so strongly that they support my amendment, this is the only opportunity we have to have success. And this clearly isn't about my success in an amendment, although I would love to see the opportunity for this amendment to be voted on. It may or may not pass, but the Senate ought to work its will in making that determination. With the broad support of the industry, with the broad support of my colleagues here in the Senate, one would think that this is an amendment that is least worthy of a vote. And that's not been the case, and so it is important for me to again reiterate to my colleagues, if you invoke cloture this afternoon, or later this morning, if you invoke cloture, there is no other opportunity for us to address this issue, this problem. And so let me again request the opportunity. I laid awake last night from 3:30 on trying to figure out what it is I could say to my colleagues to get their attention about why this was so important. And there's lots of things that can be said, and we have so little time before this is either a program that existed in the past and will no longer exist in the future, and the consequences are so dramatic that I would again request my colleagues for their assistance in at least bringing the amendment to the floor so that the Senate can make a decision, yes or no, about the merits of the amendment. This is about safety. If you'll excuse me just a moment, Mr. President. There was an article I just happened to read today in reading my clips from Kansas, and although this isn't as it's printed in a Kansas paper, but it's an AP story from Chicago. And the article is entitled "Trouble in the Air." And here's what the AP reporter writes about the planned shutdown. The article says, the planned shutdown of nearly 240 air traffic control towers across the country under federal budget cuts will strip away the extra layer of safety during takeoffs and landings, leaving pilots to manage the most critical stages of flight on their own. Airport directors and pilots say there's little doubt that the removal of this second pair of eyes on the ground increases the risk and will slow the progress that has been made in the U.S. air system being the safest in the world. It's not just private pilots in small planes who stand to be affected. Again, I'm reading from the AP story. Many of the airports in question are serviced by major airlines, and cuts could leave towers unmanned during overnight hours at some big city airports such as Chicago's Midway and General Mitchell Airport in Milwaukee. The plans have prompted airlines to review whether the changes might pose problems for commercial service that could mean canceling or rescheduling flights. Without the help of controllers, risks go up exponentially, said Mark Hanna, director of the Abraham Lincoln Capital Airport in Springfield, Illinois, which could see its tower close. Many of the aviation sectors are frustrated by the political brinksmanship in Washington that has affected such a sensitive area of aviation. Jim Montman, manager of the Santa Fe Municipal Airport, which is on the list for tower closure, said the absence of controllers raised the risk of mid-air collisions or some sort of incident where somebody lands on the wrong runway. That critical link is gone. Pilots are trained to watch for other aircraft and announce their position over the radio during approaches, landings, and takeoffs. But past crashes, however rare, have exposed weaknesses in that system. On November 19, 1996, a 19-seat United Express flight landing in Quincy, Illinois, collided with another twin-engine turboprop that was taking off. They slammed into each other at the intersection of two runways, killing 14 people aboard the two planes. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded the probable cause was a failure of the pilots in the outbound flight to monitor the radio frequency for air traffic and to properly scan for other planes. Quote, "If a tower was there, it's highly likely that the accident would have been prevented," said Hanna, who became the director of the Quincy Airport 2 years after the crash. The 238 air traffic control facilities that could be closed were chosen because they are at airports less than 150,000 flight operations per year, and they are located in every state. Again, Mr. President, the point of this amendment is not whether or not I find the right words to convince my colleagues to allow this amendment to come to a vote. And as much as I struggled through the morning hours trying to figure out what those might be, the real issue here is not about my words or about my personal success in getting this amendment considered, but it is about the safety of Americans. And I can't figure out why this amendment can't be made in order. Again, broad support, Republican, Democrat. I've had many senators, including very senior senators from the Democrat side of our aisle, come to me and express amazement that this amendment, so broadly supported, so important, cannot be considered. And I can't come up with an explanation. I don't know why this is the case. When I talk to every senator I've talked to about this amendment, tells me they don't oppose it, it ought to be voted on, they support it, and yet, for some reason, the Senate is incapable of agreeing to even a vote on an important and critical amendment that promotes the safety of the American people. I can only guess, and it's always difficult to attribute motives, but as I talk to my colleagues, the only explanation that I ever get that has any semblance of truth is there is a point to be made here. By denying the amendment's passage, we prove that sequestration can't work, that we can't cut money from budgets. And again, I didn't vote for sequestration. So when the majority leader says this morning about the hatchet being taken to programs and it's all bad, I didn't vote for sequestration. I believe in the appropriations process that allows us to make these decisions to increase funding for some things, decrease funding for other things, eliminate programs, and yet sequestration, in my view, has an effect upon all programs equally, whether they're effective or ineffective, whether they're valuable or invaluable, and we treat them the same. So I'm not here on the cause of sequestration, but apparently there are those in this city, in Washington, D.C., who want to make the point that if the air traffic control towers are eliminated, it will demonstrate once and all, I don't know, to Republican senators, to senators in general, to Congress, to the American people, that there is no opportunity to cut budgets. And if people want to make that point, and if they can convince people that it's true, that there is no opportunity to eliminate $85 billion in spending, that's fine with me. That's what this place exists for, is for us to have the debate about whether or not we can reduce spending, increase spending, what our tax code ought to be, what the value is of government services and programs, and how they ought to be funded. But if it's true that the reason that this amendment is not being considered is because we want to prove a point that there is no money to be cut, that sequestration is a bad idea, that reducing spending is always a bad idea, that we've got to raise taxes, if that's the point that's trying to be made here in this process of denying this amendment's consideration, then it's a very dangerous way to try to prove a point. Prove your point in the argument and debate about the merits of spending, about the merits of the program. Prove your point in the Appropriations Committee, in which we take testimony and hear from people about what's important to them, what priorities, what their needs are, what their wants are, what has value, what doesn't. But don't try to make the political point about this topic by reducing the safety of people who fly in and out of communities across the country, who, as the article said, reduces the nature of our air traveling safety from one of the best in the world to from the best in the world to something less than that. And so make the point, have the debate and argument about the value of sequestration, about the value of what money we spend and don't spend, but let's not try to prove the point by reducing the chances that the American people, when they travel, are safe and secure in our airways. You know, I don't know, and I hope this is never the case. This point may never be proven about the safety, but once there's an accident and somebody dies and a plane crashes, the question will always be, what if there had been an air traffic control tower there? What if we had left the program in place? And these communities that have these air traffic control towers have spent years in developing a plan to put them in place, have worked with the FAA and the Department of Transportation over decades to bring their airports and its airport safety, the flying safety, to high standards. And an issue here is that this is going to disappear overnight. So you can be an airport manager, an airport authority, a member of an airport board, any place in the country with 200 plus air traffic control towers, and you've worked hard over years, decades, to get the standards in place and to have the air traffic control process at your airport. And in one day, April the 7th, one night, the lights go off in the tower. They no longer exist. All the work that you have tried to accomplish on behalf of your community and those who fly in and out of your airport disappears in one stroke. And so, Mr. President, I speak with a level of passion about this about this issue for the purpose of which I think we are here to do is to advance the common good of the American people. And it's not a provincial amendment. It's not something that just Moran and Kansas needs. There are many states much more affected by this, but the truth is that every American, every person who flies, will have less safety and security in the skies as a result of this issue, of a result of the decision made by the Department of Transportation to eliminate this program. And so, once again, Mr. President, I intend to ask later in the morning when our leaders are on the floor for unanimous consent to bring this amendment forward before the time expires. And in my time in Congress, I've only been in the Senate a little more than 2 years. I've not been trying to be obstreperous. I've not tried to be difficult to deal with. I believe in the opportunity to work out and reach together, and I followed the rules. I did what everybody tells me you should do. Go find people who support this amendment, who are Democrats and Republicans, bring them together. And the leader said earlier in the week, I guess it's now earlier last week, about how we're going to get back to regular order. We're going to have amendments offered. I hope we can dispose of them quickly. We have an opportunity to do that with this amendment. It's not controversial. It's not partisan. It's about something that ought to be of importance to all Americans and certainly to every senator. And so, Mr. President, later in the morning when the leaders are present, I'll ask unanimous consent once again that we consider this amendment. I know that there's others who want to offer amendments. I see my colleagues from Arkansas and Missouri on the floor. I know they have an amendment, it's I think number 82, in which they want to offer the opportunity to address a problem in which they want to take money from one account and put it in another account in order to keep meat packing plants operational, that we have the meat inspectors present at the plants. Boy, that's an important issue, too. That's about the safety and security of Americans, about their food safety. I hope, Mr. President, that no one objects to the amendment that Mr. Pryor and Mr. Blunt are going to offer this morning. That's another amendment that is very similar in nature about deciding that we're smarter to spend money here than here. And so I would ask my colleagues, as the Pryor-Blunt amendment comes before the floor, I would ask my colleagues, just as I would ask them to grant unanimous consent, I hope no one objects to their request for unanimous consent that their amendment be considered. And I would ask that no one object to the amendment that I intend to offer. I certainly will not object to the Blunt-Pryor amendment. I wish that it was leveraged to get my amendment considered, but it's too dangerous to play that game. That's what we do here in Washington, D.C., is try to strike the deal. And in this case, when we strike that deal, we're leaving people behind whose lives are going to be adversely affected. And I certainly wouldn't stand in the way of the people who work in the meatpacking industry and the consumers who consume meat products across our country in the way of trying to solve a problem that's clearly there. And I hope their amendment receives unanimous consent, and I hope it passes by this Senate's will. And I would ask the same thing when the appropriate time comes. I will ask for the same thing on an amendment that is about safety and security of the American people. I thank the President for his indulgence and at least his appearance of listening to me, and I would note the absence of quorum.